My name is Lamad from the GMS, the Engineer 2 camp. I want to give all praises to Yahawah by Sham Yahawashi, double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. Shalom to all the sincere Akim, laboring in truest sincerity. Um, Basically today, I had this article. It's entitled so I give room for a second. From the Google Newsstand, I got it. It's from the Google Newsstand, and it's entitled "The Pilgrims Were Queer." I mean, that's the title of this, right? As you can see, the Slocky. As you can see, you see a picture of the pilgrims in the background, but then you have a rainbow flag, and it's a picture of the so-called white man, the Edomites, giving the basically so-called intermingling or whatever with the Gadites, the tribe of Gad. And so I said the title of this article is "The Pilgrims Were Queer," right? So I'm going to just read this article because I came across it and I just thought it was interesting. I'm going to just bring out a couple of scriptures and then leave it at that. But so it says, as you sit down for turkey, corn, and the arguments with relatives at Thanksgiving this year, take a moment to give thanks to Thomas Morton, who founded what could be considered America's first queer hippie colony in 1625. So it says, today, Marymount is a quiet neighborhood of Quincy, Massachusetts. Residents explain that the name is an English translation of its original name, Passion, uh, Passianagesite. It said, but bless their heart, the truth may be more exciting. According to historians and original records, the Pilgrims founded an unusually queer society, one that wasn't straight up accepting of all the queerness per se. It said, but had a more complicated relationship with it than you might think. In fact, as historians note, the name Marymount uh, can also refer to a Latin phrase meaning erect phallus, quite a coincidence given the men erected an 80-foot pole in the center of town. Which is, goes back to the, like in Egypt, how we always talk about how in Egypt, they had the phallic symbols, which were, representations of the penis or whatever, which, they would call the Egyptians, they called it the obelisk. And you got it. I think it's the what is it though? In DC, you have obelisks there, so they're trying to do the same thing that they did in Egypt, in America. So it says, through our modern understanding of sexuality, would have been completely foreign to them. Early European immigrants experienced same-sex attraction just as I'm reading it where it says we do today, and they had queer sex, entered queer relationships, and formed queer households in ways that are surprisingly familiar. Because they did those same things. As much as they would try and make it seem like there were these, religious people, blasey blahs, what I'm saying? Esau, he was, he practiced what the Most High calls in the scriptures abomination. So it says, and though early laws call for the death penalty of sodomy and boogery, it says, and a matter of fact, when it says early laws, I'm gonna read to you the law, which I mean, this is it's pretty simple, you know what I mean? Everybody that knows anything should know this, you know what I mean? This is Salakia. This is Salakia. Leviticus, the book of Leviticus 20 and 13. It says, if a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death, and their blood shall be upon them. So that's pretty straightforward. It's talking about if a man has sex with another man, if a woman has sex with a woman, they committed an abomination, which is a filthy, detestable act in the eyes of the Most High. And it's saying that both of them shall be put to death. So that's a capital punishment. It said their blood shall be upon them, meaning it was their fault. It was their own doing. So going back to this article, it said in boogery, right? In boogery, let's look at that word boogery real quick. This is boogery. It says anal intercourse. So that's basically boogery. It says in English law, boogery was first used in the Boogery Act of 1533, while Section 61 of the Offense Against the Person Act 1861 entered sodomy and bestiality to find punishments for the abominable crime of boogery committed either with man or with any animal. And a lot of people. The funny thing is, a lot of people say King James is a homosexual or whatever. But when he was in power, from what I know, what I mean, he had that was in their laws. So if he was a sodomite, just like how Barack Obama, he was president, but he made these things. He made these things. He legalized during his presidency. He legalized or allowed illegal allowed sodomy or same-sex marriage, which we know is an abomination, to be legalized. So why aren't the so-called black people in uproar about that? Why do they hold him in such high esteem? That's the question, what I'm saying, you got to ask yourself. All right, so let's see. Says despite the prohibition on same-sex intercourse, there were circumstances where they were tolerated or at least ignored. It says, and penalties gradually weakened. It says, over the course of the 1600s, in part of necessity, because such encounters were so common, according to Michael Browski, a professor of practice in media and activism in studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard. In other words, yes, many of the pilgrims in whose honor we celebrate Thanksgiving were queer. Let me see. Yeah, so I mean that's something to think about when you think about the fact that because that basically the pilgrims, what I'm saying, they were like basically criminals that they basically like exiled, or like say for example, like I've heard stories about like in Cuba, Castro, like that movie Scarface or whatever, that kind of illustrates it when he basically in the movie he sent like people, Cubans or whatever, that were prisoners, criminals or whatever. He sent them to America, or that they ended up in Miami. That's what that in the movie Scarface that was basically saying, where they had the little camp or whatever, and Al Pacino was in there. So what I'm saying, the so-called pilgrims were brought over here the same way. They were like exiles basically. Uh, so all right. So it says when they arrived in what they called the America, colonizers sought a city upon a hill that is an example of religious purity. But the inhabitants of that land certainly didn't meet their biblical expectations, particularly when it came to gender roles. Indigenous gender role, not all the time, but a considerable amount, were completely foreign to the Europeans, said Bronsky. Either tribe had their own word for it, but there was considerable amount of gender fluidity. So basically, um, I mean, we did a video a couple months ago or whatever, about the Pennsylvania Indians, and they talked about their roles, like how the women had certain roles and the men had certain roles. So basically, and they didn't, the women, they would play their roles. They wouldn't try and put on the pants and act like men. they would play their role. It's like an honor for the women to basically do, you know what I'm saying, their womanly duties and all this. They stayed in their lane, so to speak. So it said among the Mammoth Salakia, Mamatari tribe, the journals of Lewis and Clark recorded men allowed to wear Salakia. What the hell? Salakia. Salakia, hold up. Among the Mamatari tribe, the journals of Lewis and Clark recorded men allowed to wear women's clothes and marry other men. Among the Crow, men were honored for expressing feminine roles. The Europeans were totally scandalized, said Bronsky. Despite their heterosexual aspirations, the Pilgrims found that sodomy just refused to stop happening among their ilk. Though they passed laws to encourage heterosexual marriage and reproduction, Bronsky said clearly they were, he said, quote, clearly they were fucking before they were married. It says in a 1978 paper entitled Things Fearful to Name, historian Robert F. Oakes describes colonialists who were what we would today call queer. For example, there was the 1629 arrival of the ship Talbot carrying 5 beastly sodomitical boys who confessed their wickedness not to be named. They were sent back to England for trial. In 1637, John Alexander and Thomas Robert were accused of lewd behavior and unclean carriage one with another. It said often spending their seed on upon another. The fuck? Alexander was beaten, branded, and exiled. Robert was whipped and returned to indentured servitude in 1649. It said Mary Hammond, and Sarah Norman were accused of lewd behavior, each with other upon a bed, and diverse lascivious speeches. It says Norman was sent to make a public acknowledgement so far as conveniently may be of her unchaste behavior. It said there exists It said there exists little record of queer life in the colonies, since criminal complaints were generally the only accusation on which they were detailed. It said Thomas Morton's founding of Marymount remained among the most vivid. Marymount denizens are described as having rejected the strict rules of the Puritans, declaring all servants and slaves to be free and encourage intermingling with indigenous Algonquian people. It said Morton declared himself Lord of Misrule, and his people were described by Nathaniel Hawthorne as a crew of Camas, a reference to a mythological figure during whose ceremonies men and women exchanged clothing. It said Hawthorne's description of Marymount, written 2 centuries later, it said could refer to a pride parade today. It said one was a youth in glistening apparel with a scarf of the rainbow pattern crosswise on their breast. There was the likeness of a bear erect, brute in all but his hind legs, which were adorned with pink silk stockings. It says, on one particular exciting occasion, the residents of Marymount erected a maypole and danced in a manner described as evoking Ganymede and Zeus figures that often symbolize same-sex couplings. This proto-pride proved a bit too much for the neighbors who arrested Morton, chopped down the pole, and scattered the residents. It said, but Puritan objections to homosexuality were not entirely rooted in what we would call gender normality. The earliest sodomy laws are not prohibiting homosexual sex per se. So, Bronsky, it said they're prohibiting non-reproductive sex. So if you had anal sex with your wife, that would be a crime. The most important thing was to produce, because half the children died when they were infants. Uh, let's see. Said, indeed, the Puritans often avoided applying prescribed punishments for queer sex. It said Nicholas Cincian, for example, was brought before a court in 1672, having proposed numerous men over the preceding 30 years. I'm sorry, Slage. Having propositioned numerous men over the preceding 30 years, he took me and threw me on the chest and took hold on my privy parts. Testified one man. Session was merely admonished at least twice during those decades before finally being whipped, fined, and shamed. It was yet another case. Historian Lindy Bissell wrote of authorities using the law to enforce obedience only when other means had failed and violations of norms were flagrant. It says, despite many settlements calling for the death penalty for sodomy, colonizers found that conditions were so harsh and community so uh, delicate that it had that it was inadvisable to kill except in the most extreme cases. As a result, they often found reason to forgive same-sex intercourse when it was discovered. Let's see. Salakia. Yeah, I mean it's pretty much the point. I mean, yeah, it's pretty much the point. Let me see. Hit a couple scriptures and I'll just end it on that. Let me see. All right, let's hit this one real quick. This is Isaiah. So like I'll get this one. This is a basic scripture, not basic, but this is Second Peter 2:6. It says. It says, in turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemn them with an overthrow, making them an ensample unto those that after should live ungodly. Because, that story, was the fact that sodomy and all these types of iniquities were the Most High. He despised these things, so that's why he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's like, why? What is he gonna? So if he destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, what makes people think that he's gonna basically turn the other cheek? I mean, so like not turn the cheek, but he's gonna turn his back, or not want to do the same thing to other civilizations that commit the same abomination, filthy, wicked, detestable act. So I hope this is edifying. You know what I'm saying? I just wanted to bring this out, and I hope this is edifying. And so all praises to Yahawah, Shem Yahawashi, double honors to the elders of Great Millstone, Shalom to all the sincere Akim, Shalom.